Hey friends, Sean from SGT Report here with one of our favorite folks, Harley Schlanger, the national spokesperson for the LaRouche organization on the line. Harley, welcome back.
Hey Sean, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. Happy 2013. It's been a while since we've spoken.
Yes, it has, and I just read an article by a leading French insider who said 2013 is looking a lot like 1913, and that's bad news if you remember what happened in 1913.
I know that you say there's significant developments over the last week with some of the Federal Reserve insiders even calling for the breakup of the big banks. That's good news. I know we want to talk about that. Lots to cover. One of the things that really has me and so many others concerned, Harley, I'd like to get your opinion on this at some point in the call, is we see Feinstein, Obama, Cuomo, Bloomberg, Rahm Emanuel, all coming after the guns and the Second Amendment, which is our last line of defense for liberty. So much to talk about. Where would you like to begin?
We could start with that. I think the most important thing on that is that it's an important issue, but they're never going to get it in the legislative form because there are too many Democrats in purple districts who have to appeal to moderate Democrats and Republicans to get reelected. And so the danger is that Obama, as he's done in so many ways, will go with an executive order. And what we're seeing with these executive orders, which really took off with Bush and Cheney, but Obama has gone far beyond what they did, is that you essentially have a dictatorship because he's taking over what is prescribed to be the responsibility only of the Congress, whether it's war fighting, whether it's budgetary policy. Obama is acting as a dictator. So people are right to be concerned about this. I think the Congress is not going to be where this fight is fought. But I would just add one other point, which is that people who have a passion on this issue should not allow themselves to be pigeonholed into a single issue, because we're about to see the whole Constitution destroyed, and we're about to have what's left of our financial system destroyed. And we also see the president in a de facto alliance with al-Qaeda, arming terrorists who then come back and kill Americans. So I think we've got to keep a broad perspective here and realize that the best way to fight this is in the broad way. And I know that goes against the way most people think, because they think here's a hot-button issue, let's go for the hot-button issue. But you're not only up against Obama, you're up against the media, and you're up against a largely poorly informed public, to be polite. And so I think we've got to aim our sights at the higher issue of defending the whole Constitution and the unity of the principles embedded in the Constitution, rather than get trapped into a single issue, even an important one like the Second Amendment.
The fact that you just said, largely a media that is essentially bought and paid for. The media is not on the side of the people. The media is clearly on the side of the oligarchy. The media is controlled by what? 5 or 6, 7 major corporations, international globalist corporations that would like nothing better than to see the people disarmed. The deck is so stacked against us, we can't even get a fair shake in the media. But the good news is the mainstream media is a dinosaur. The Mockingbird media is dying, and it's alternative news programs and alternative resources for news that are growing by leaps and bounds, right?
Well, that's a hope, and that's a definite reality. But I would say the real issue here is that the media can lie all they want. For the most part, as long as people are focused on the Super Bowl and Manti Te'o and topless clubs and movies and things of that sort, the media can be effective. But what we're seeing is an insertion into people's minds of reality. And that reality is that I don't care what's happening with the stock market. And I know your listeners know that that's just a complete game. But the idea that we're in a recovery, that the banking system stabilized in 2012, which is the line in Europe now. The euro's taken care of, everything's fine. In the U.S., it's that the Bernanke policy, the quantitative easing, the TARP, and everything else has stabilized the banking system. So now we're poised for a recovery. There's no recovery, and this is where the media can put out figures and statistics and everything else. The average person knows that we're in a worse situation by far today than we were in 2008, 2009. And secondly, that nothing that's being proposed is going to help. And so you're right, people are waking up. I just did a tour of some of the western states, in San Francisco, I was in Los Angeles, a town meeting in Salt Lake City, and we had fairly substantial attendance, but people who were really committed to getting at this question of not just what's going on and who's doing this to us, but what do we do? What can we do? And I think that's a really good starting point for us to make sure that 2013 doesn't become a year like 1913, where we saw the creation of the Federal Reserve, the IRS, the Anti-Defamation League, and the build-up to World War I. We don't need another year like that.
Yeah, you're right. And we are seeing cracks in this unified front. The central banks appear to no longer trust each other, with Germany wanting its gold back from the Bank of France and at least some of its gold back from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. You cited in an email to me recently here, Harley, that I really wanted to touch on. You're seeing significant developments, you wrote, about some of the insiders at the Federal Reserve calling for the breakup of the big banks. How significant is that, Harley?
It's very significant because you have two people who had bernanke's voting against Bernanke's quantitative easing policy, one who's no longer the Kansas City Federal Reserve President, Thomas Honig. But Honig is now on the board of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, and he's a very substantial voice. And he's getting covered regularly now in the American Banker and Fortune, Forbes, major media. And he's calling for a breakup of the so-called too-big-to-fail banks. But most importantly, by the way, he's also calling explicitly for a return to Glass-Steagall. What he's saying is that the Volcker rule and the Dodd-Frank bill are forcing the big banks to take even greater risks. At the same time, there's no downside for them with those risks, because if they fail, they'll get bailed out. So the idea of moral hazard is completely gone. Now, Honig is not a voice in the wilderness. He was joined just the other day, January 16th. Richard Fisher, the president of the Dallas Federal Reserve, delivered a very insightful and important speech in Washington, D.C., where he didn't call for Glass-Steagall, but he said we must break up too big to fail. The Dallas Fed is putting out a specific proposal on this. But what he attacked the idea of the inflationary bailout policies. But he said in particular what that's doing is destroying the community banks and the local banks because they're cut off from capital. All the money is being channeled to 10 to 12 large banks. And so he said we have to cut the shadow banking system off the tit of federal government. No more bailouts for them. And the only thing we'll do is protect the commercial banks, which is essentially Glass-Steagall. Now then, in addition to them, you have in Europe, you have a real fight developing because one of the most important banks in Italy, the Monte dei Paschi Bank of Siena, which is the oldest surviving bank in Europe, it's the third largest bank in Italy. They just had a derivatives loss, which started at $200 million, then went up to about $4 billion. They just got a bailout from the president of Italy, who's the old Goldman Sachs guy, Mario Monti.
Right.
And what's happening with this bank is that it's sending shudders through Europe because all the Italian banks are in similar shape. And the Italian banks are completely connected to the French banks. And the French banking system is larger and at this point extremely weak. And so you had the interesting situation we're at Davos, Switzerland, where they have the annual confab of the leading financial elites, and publicly they're saying everything's fine, things are looking good, the banks shouldn't be attacked. That was what Jamie Dimon from J.P. Morgan Chase said. And then they said, oh, don't worry, we're going to have growth. We're going to have a $10 trillion fund for green development, which is essentially a swindle and a boondoggle. But behind the scenes at the nightclubs and the bars, they're saying, what's going on in Italy? Why is Germany demanding its gold back? Is Germany going to leave the euro? Can Greece hold? What's happening in Spain? And then what's going on with Richard Fisher, Thomas Honig, and others in the United States? So we're seeing, even among the usually self-confident, self-proclaimed masters of the universe, like Jamie Dimon and Blankfein and others, they can see the writing on the wall. And I think this is a moment where those of us who have been fighting to break up the Fed, I'm not putting forward the Fed as a solution just because, but when you have a couple of insiders saying this, it tells you that the understanding is that the whole system is rotten. So this is an opportunity for us to make a fundamental change in the direction of policy of the last 40 years.
And I'm going to ramble here a bit, so jump in at any point that you see fit. But I just want to touch on the derivatives mess there in Italy.
Sure.
Because as you well know, we've talked about this a million times before and with others, once this derivatives dominoes Ponzi begins to fall, the end could come like a thief in the night. I mean, it could all explode in a 24-hour period.
Exactly. You could have a hyperinflationary collapse instantaneously, because the hyperinflation is already there. The trillions of dollars they've put out to back up the 700 trillion in derivative obligations, which is the figure that I saw from Davos. And by the way, there's a very interesting article in Forbes this week that goes through the case of J.P. Morgan Chase, which has 70 trillion in its books of derivatives. Now, what happens is that this is mostly where trading is occurring, and derivatives such as mortgage-backed security contracts, collateralized debt obligations, interbank paper, interbank lending, all of it is paper that has a face value that's marked far and above what they could get for it in an open market. In fact, sometimes they talk about 30-to-1 leverage. It's probably closer to 100-to-1 by now, maybe even 1,000-to-1. The only trading that's going on, though, is of this paper, what was called in 2008 toxic assets. Now, the idea is that as long as they have confidence in each other's paper, and this is what the Fed bailout does, that they know that if someone tries to trade in at face value one of their financial instruments, that the bank can go and say, well, look, we have a backup from the Fed that's good, so you don't really need the whole thing, do you? Well, what happens if you have a September 2008 moment, as we just saw with this bank in Italy, where the other banks won't take their paper? Then they've got to start coming up with the money. In the case of the Monte dei Paschi Bank, they had to come up with 4 billion euros from the Bank of Italy. Suppose J.P. Morgan Chase had a margin call on a derivative, and it triggered the insurance, the so-called risk insurance, a credit default swap. You're going to see trillions of dollars suddenly pour into the system, at which point, against a real asset of almost nothing. And that's where the hyperinflation comes in, and that's where you're going to see a crash. And so you're absolutely right, Sean. It could happen at any moment. Now, that doesn't mean, you have a lot of the people out there, and I see them occasionally on your site, who say, well, you've been predicting a crash for years and it hasn't happened. It doesn't mean that everything isn't in place for it. It just means that we haven't had that magical moment where, as Lloyd Blankfein famously said, Richard Fuld of Lehman famously said, so now I'm the schmuck, when everyone said, we're not taking your paper anymore. He suddenly realized that the game was over. And instead of limiting that to Lehman, it triggered a response through the whole system, and we nearly did lose the banking system, and that's why the bailouts were done. We've got to end these bailouts. These bailouts are killing our economy and killing our people.
Well, Harley, fortunately, most of the audience that is listening to us right now knows that these problems are extremely grave and that the American economy, the U.S. economy, is truly in a bad position. Now, Obama is, just went through his inauguration, and he's saying, thanks for giving me the opportunity to finish what I've started. Now, how scary is that? But let me ask you this. LaRouche has been discussing himself the special role of gold and silver in a credit-based system. Let's talk a little bit about the special role of gold and silver. What does your organization say should be done?
Well, Mr. LaRouche did a webcast about 2 weeks ago on a Friday night where he opened by talking about the fallacy of the belief in money. And he said that what we have is we don't even have paper money anymore. We have computer notations, valuations that are out of whack with anything that's real. And what he said is that there's no value inherent in any printed money. Now, the benefit of gold and silver is that there is some value in it. There's inherent value in it, but not enough. If you took all the gold in the world, you wouldn't have enough to create enough credit to get ourselves out of this. But if you use gold and silver as a reserve, and you're rigorous in your approach to this, then you can actually generate credit. And the payment for the credit doesn't have to go back to the gold and silver. The payment for the credit will come from the productive capabilities you put in place by using the credit effectively. But at least if you have a well-run economy, you're still going to have some innovations that won't work. But if necessary, at least you have the fallback of the gold and silver, so you're not just printing completely worthless pieces of paper. Now, this is something that has been understood, at least in our country, going back to the Founding Fathers, because we had paper currency then. Benjamin Franklin has a famous argument in favor of paper currency, but not paper currency with nothing behind it. What was behind it in his mind is a productive capability. And in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 100 years before Franklin, they had what was called the pine tree shilling, where, if necessary, they put pine trees behind the shilling. But at least with a pine tree, you had something of value. They didn't have much gold in the United States at that time, or in the colonies. But as we developed a system, whenever we've functioned to produce a surplus, it's been because we had a backing of the currency, and that backing was ultimately the commitment to use credit to produce, to develop industry, to develop the Transcontinental Railroad, for example, with Lincoln's greenback policy. And the idea that it's as strong as the dollar. Well, when the dollar is backed by a productive economy, but then underneath it you have a reserve, then you have an economy where people will have trust. Right now, who could possibly trust Bernanke and the Federal Reserve? The other thing I wanted to say on the Fed, by the way, Sean, which I'm sure you saw this, the 2007 minutes from the Federal Open Market Committee were just released. And in July of 2007, July 25th, LaRouche gave a webcast in which he said there's no way that we're not going to have a serious banking crisis and probably a collapse of the banking system. 1 week later, at a Federal Open Market Committee meeting, Bernanke said the fundamentals are sound and there's no instability in the system. And 3 days after that, Bear Stearns went belly up. And then, of course, within the next year, the whole system went. So these guys are wrong repeatedly. So who could have trust and faith in Bernanke?
Well, nobody.
And Geithner? Of course not.
Yeah, not even the Germans. Isn't that the funny part? Not even the other central banks. And I think this is such an important conversation we're having here about gold-backed currency, silver-backed credit system here, because, I've interviewed G. Edward Griffin and I've interviewed Bill Still, and they both have opposing views on this. G. Edward Griffin thinks a return to a gold standard is exactly what we need because he knows the criminality that, occurred in 1913 with this Federal Reserve System. On the other hand, you have Bill Still, who argues for a credit-based system, and he says the biggest mistake we could make is returning to a gold-backed system because all the rich guys have all the gold. Now, what you guys are saying is somewhere right in the middle, and I tend to be in your camp.
You see, I think the argument, and I've heard Ron Paul make this argument, the reason you have to go to a gold standard is because you can't trust people or governments. Now, the problem with that is that then you can't really live in this society. Unless you want to, as I was saying the other day, that people were saying, well, as long as I have guns and beef jerky, then I'm okay. And I said, well, I hope you're willing to die to protect your beef jerky, because if we get to that point, that's what's going to happen. Well,
let me tell you this, because that is exactly what G. Edward Griffin said. This is the conversation I had with G. Edward Griffin. I said, so, we could return to just a credit-based paper system where the U.S. Treasury is issuing the money, and all we need for that to work is to be able to trust the government. All we need is an honorable government, to which G. Edward Griffin says, he laughed, and he said there is no such thing as an honorable government.
Well, and that's exactly what Ron Paul told me, is that you can't trust human beings to run an honest system because of the problem of greed. And, of course, this argument comes from Bernard de Mandeville. This is the argument underlying Adam Smith. And the basic argument was used in the 19th century to establish the British Empire. The British Empire was the gold standard. And that was because they wanted to control credit so no other country could develop. And the developments in the latter part of the 19th century, which allowed for the growth of Germany and France and even Russia, China, was the move to an American system credit policy that was brought to them by a man named Henry Carey, whose father, Matthew Carey, was the publisher of Benjamin Franklin's works and a close ally, an Irish Republican ally of Franklin. And what Carey argued is that the American system functions based on the idea that you fight to have a government of, by, and for the people. And that if the people won't do that, then whatever government they have is going to be a tyranny. And so you really, if you're an every man for himself, which is what happens under a gold standard, is that you're going to have a return to the worst forms of empires and piracy and control of wealth by a small handful of people. Now, how is that different from today? Well, it's not so different from today. The real issue here is, will the American people take a little bit of time to figure this out, to study history, to study real economics, and realize that ultimately our only safeguard is our commitment to honesty and truthfulness and fundamental principles of economic production.
That's right. And most folks won't take time to figure it out, as you well know, Harley, but even going back to the revolutionary period of this country fighting against the British, it was only 5% of well-informed patriots.
But they won. You see, that's the point.
Yeah.
A small group of people with an intention which is good, but which can be manifested through their works. People that worked with Franklin and funded the American Revolution included shipbuilders, it included coppersmiths, it included poor farmers, but people who looked to the future and said, we're not going to live under the tyranny of a control of our country by private interests, especially private interests across the ocean. And, today we've given up our sovereignty to these City of London banks and these Wall Street banks. And now in Europe, the same thing's happened. They've given up the sovereignty of nations. And what you're seeing in Germany is really mixed, because on the one hand, the German political elite are still defending what they call the universal banking system, which is the too big to fail system. And yet it's not working for Germany. And Germany can't bail out all of Europe. So just to come to a solution, I think that this idea that 5% armed with powerful, good ideas that have been validated by history really can make a big difference. And we have right now, again, a bill, it's H.R. 129, the Glass-Steagall Restoration Act, from Marcy Kaptur and a Republican, Congressman Walter Jones from North Carolina, are the co-sponsors. This is a bill that, if someone would fight for, would create exactly the debate we need, as opposed to this nonsense around the fiscal cliff. And you realize, after the deal that was made the other day, what happened to the argument that if we didn't resolve this by December 31st, we were going to lose everything?
Right.
It was just a fraud.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have a chance now to have a real substantive debate, which is something other than taking the banks as sacrosanct. And then the other solution being, all we have to do is go with enough austerity. You'll never generate enough productive wealth with austerity or taxes to move toward bringing the budget into balance. You've got to increase production.
Harley, there's something I really do need to touch on with you, though, and it relates to our discussion of honorable government. Rule of law in a healthy republic, in a healthy country, is absolutely critical, and it's clear that we don't really have rule of law in this country anymore. And what I want to ask you about is, you folks have been talking for quite some time now about the absolute necessity for the impeachment process to begin on Barack Obama. And the reason I bring that up is because his Attorney General, Eric Holder, has a very, very troubling past going all the way back to Oklahoma City. And more recently with this Fast and Furious debacle in which this government was shipping arms to Mexican drug lords and doing that willingly in a false flag operation, trying to demonize those weapons and ultimately demonize the Second Amendment. This man is still in power. This man is supposedly the highest law enforcement agent in the U.S. government. I'm very fearful for where we sit now because we no longer have rule of law. And where do you stand on impeachment? Where do you stand on Eric Holder? Where do you stand on Fast and Furious? Because I think that's what's got us all so concerned.
Sure, very, very succinctly. Obama has to be impeached. He has a contempt for our Constitution. He has done everything he can to violate both the letter and the law of the Constitution. Now, in terms of Holder, look, there's a very interesting development, which is that Lanny Brewer, who was the one who covered up for Holder in Fast and Furious, he was the deputy attorney general. he announced his resignation yesterday, 2 days after PBS Frontline quoted him talking about why we can't prosecute any bankers. And his argument was not that they didn't violate the law. His argument was that the banking system is so fragile that bringing down a major bank could bring down the whole financial system. So here was an open contempt expressed for law, that bankers can break the law, as Hong Kong and Shanghai did with its drug money laundering, as Obama is doing by engaging in offensive military activity without going through the Congress, whether it's in Libya, Mali, Algeria, or Syria. So, look, Holder has to go. With all these people resigning, I don't understand why Holder's staying, except obviously it's to protect Obama. I think that the door just is barely a crack open by this Benghazi hearing because most of the Congress was too terrified. And the issue is not Hillary. The issue is Obama and his policy of arming al-Qaeda to overthrow Gaddafi and doing the same thing. He is aligned with al-Qaeda. And if we had a few people up there with guts, we could get a steamroll process going that would get him out of office so we wouldn't have to have a second term of Obama. Now, the question that always comes up, Sean, is people say, well, can you trust Biden? Of course not, but I'll tell you one thing. Biden's a smart enough politician that if he sees the Congress throw out Obama, he's not going to follow Obama policies. And if he does, then he'll be thrown out. So the real issue here is not can it happen, will it happen? It's will we make it happen? And that's the challenge to the American people.
Well, Harley, we sure do appreciate your time, as always. Thanks so much. Why don't you tell people what you got cooking and tell people how they can find you on the net?
Yeah, last time I was on, I gave out my phone number, and I did receive some calls, and I shocked everyone by calling them back. I'm going to be out of the country for a little while, but if someone would like to talk to me, they could reach me directly through my email, which is harleysch@gmail.com. And I will respond to people. Otherwise, go to LaRouchePAC.com. Lyndon LaRouche does a webcast where he discusses these issues that we've been talking about, and in his own way. And he's, I think, at this point, not that he ever held back, but he's never been more forthright in his discussions than now. And I think it'd be very beneficial for people to engage in that kind of dialogue with him.
Yeah, and just so folks know, back in the day, I know there's some polarization about Lyndon LaRouche. Who is he? A lot of people don't understand, and they believe talking points that they've heard over time. But there was a time in the not-too-distant past, Harley, where the LaRouche organization was considered as having one of the premier private intelligence gathering networks in the world.
Well, that was a comment made by one of Reagan's national security advisors, Norman Bailey. Not only that, but Ronald Reagan, who's still an icon for conservatives, brought Lyndon LaRouche in as his secret negotiator with the Russians on what became the Strategic Defense Initiative. And a lot of conservatives who say LaRouche is a big government socialist don't know what the hell they're talking about. Those are the lines that were put out largely by LaRouche's leftist enemies to try and poison his appeal to mainstream patriots. So, I've always said, think for yourself.
Yeah, and this audience does, and the reason I wanted to touch on that is because we all know that we're being lied to. We're being lied to by the government. We're being lied to by the people in control on the left. We're being lied to by the people in control on the right. We're being lied to by the media. So that's why we have you on, Harley, because your truth cuts through. And it's really hard to be a consistent liar. It's really hard for liars not to get caught in their own webs, and that's what I love about you guys, because your information always cuts true, because it's truthful.
Well, thank you, Sean, and I appreciate what you're doing, and I wish we had more people like you out there.
Well, the audience is growing, and there's a lot more people starting websites and speaking out on YouTube and in other places, and thanks for all you're doing.
Sure. Good talking to you.
You too, man. Bye-bye.